The badge would cost him everything he had worked toward since childhood. Peter Norman adjusted his warm-up jacket in the tunnel beneath Mexico City's Olympic Stadium. Around him, the sounds of 80,000 spectators filtered down through concrete and steel. October 16, 1968. The 200-meter final. He had qualified with the second fastest time of his life, earning the right to stand among the world's 8 fastest men. The Australian flag waited on his tracksuit. His lane assignment was posted. Everything had proceeded according to plan. But plans were about to change. In lane 3, Tommy Smith stretched his legs with the fluid grace of a man who had broken world records. The American sprinter was heavily favored to win gold. His teammate, John Carlos in lane 4, possessed the raw speed to challenge for silver or bronze. Norman, drawn in lane 5, represented Australia's best hope for a medal in 20 years. The mathematical odds favored the Americans, but Norman had run fast enough to belong in this company. He pulled off his jacket and felt the evening air against his skin. Mexico City's thin atmosphere had bothered some athletes, but Norman had adapted well during the weeks of training and preliminary rounds. His coach nodded from the stands. His family would be watching from Melbourne, gathered around television sets in the early morning hours of October 17th. A medal would validate years of sacrifice, training, and belief. The starter called them to their marks. 8 men settled into starting blocks that had been precisely measured and positioned. The stadium fell silent except for the distant hum of television cameras and the whispered instructions of officials. Norman had visualized this moment thousands of times during training runs and sleepless nights. The race itself would last under 20 seconds, but those seconds could define the rest of his life. The gun fired. Norman exploded from the blocks with perfect technique, his stride finding its rhythm within the first 30 meters. Smith pulled ahead quickly, his long legs eating up the track with mechanical precision. Carlos stayed close. Norman ran in the outside lane, unable to see the full field, focused only on the finish line and the burning sensation building in his legs. The curve felt smooth. The straightaway opened before him like a promise. He crossed the line in 20.06 seconds, a personal best, an Australian record. The time placed him second behind Smith's new world record of 19.83. Carlos had taken bronze. Norman looked up at the scoreboard to confirm what his body already knew. He had won Olympic silver. The medal ceremony would take place later that evening, after the other track events concluded and the stadium had time to reset. Norman returned to the warm-up track to cool down, his mind still processing the magnitude of what had just happened. He was now an Olympic medalist, one of only 3 men in the world who had run faster than 20.06 seconds that year. But as he jogged slowly around the practice track, Smith and Carlos approached him with a request that would test more than his running ability. They planned to make a statement during the medal ceremony, a protest against racial inequality in America. They would raise their fists during the national anthem, a gesture of black power that would send a message to the world. They asked Norman if he supported their cause. Did he believe in human rights? Would he stand with them? Norman listened quietly as they explained their intentions. The Olympic Project for Human Rights had been organizing athlete protests throughout the 1968 Games. Several black American athletes had considered boycotting Mexico City entirely. Smith and Carlos had chosen to compete but used their platform to speak for those who had no voice. Norman told them he understood their struggle. He believed in what they were trying to accomplish, but he had no black power salute to offer, no raised fist that would make sense coming from a white Australian sprinter. What could he do? Smith suggested he wear a badge. The Olympic Project for Human Rights had created small pins that supporters could display. Norman could wear one during the ceremony, a simple gesture that would show solidarity without requiring him to adopt symbols that weren't his own, Norman agreed. The decision came easily, instinctively, without the careful calculation that had marked his approach to training and competition. Ida felt right. It felt necessary. Hours later, as the sun set over Mexico City, the 3 men walked onto the track for the medal ceremony. Norman had pinned the small badge to his Australian tracksuit, positioned where cameras would capture it clearly. Smith and Carlos had removed their shoes and wore only black socks, symbolizing black poverty. They had divided a pair of black gloves between them, each planning to raise one fist. The Australian team officials in the stands had no idea what was coming. Norman's coach focused on the pride of seeing his athlete on the Olympic podium. Back in Melbourne, television viewers prepared to watch their countrymen receive silver In what promised to be a routine celebration of athletic achievement, the three men took their positions on the podium. Smith at the top, Norman to his right, Carlos to his left. The Australian flag rose beside the American flag as the first notes of the Star-Spangled Banner echoed through the stadium. The anthem played. Smith and Carlos bowed their heads and raised their fists. Norman stood straight, hands at his sides, the human rights badge visible on his chest. The image lasted 90 seconds. It would endure for 50 years. The immediate reaction was swift and predictable. American television broadcasters struggled to explain what they had witnessed. Mexican officials looked confused. In the stadium, some spectators booed, while others sat in stunned silence. The protest had achieved exactly what Smith and Carlos intended. It was impossible to ignore. For Norman, standing between the two Americans, the consequences would unfold more slowly, but prove more devastating. He had supported their gesture without participating in it directly, but that distinction would matter little to those who viewed any solidarity as betrayal. Australian Olympic officials were furious. They had not authorized any political statements. They had sent Norman to Mexico City to run fast and represent his country with dignity, not to involve himself in American racial politics. The badge was small, barely visible to most observers, but cameras had captured it clearly. News photographers would ensure the image circulated worldwide. Back in Australia, the reaction mixed outrage with confusion. Many Australians struggled to understand why their sprinter had chosen to align himself with a Black Power protest. The civil rights movement was an American issue, they argued. Norman should have focused on his athletic achievement rather than making political statements on foreign soil. The criticism intensified over the following days and weeks. Australian newspapers questioned Norman's judgment. Sports administrators expressed disappointment. Some fans felt betrayed, arguing that athletes should remain neutral in political matters. The narrative shifted from Norman's remarkable athletic performance to his decision to wear the badge. Norman defended his choice in interviews, explaining his belief in human rights and racial equality. He pointed out that he had not raised his fist or adopted any of the specific symbols of Black Power. He had simply shown support for basic human dignity, but the explanations failed to satisfy his critics. The consequences extended far beyond public opinion. When Australian track officials selected the team for the 1972 Munich Olympics, Norman's name was absent, despite running qualifying times. He had posted the fifth fastest 200-meter time in the world that year, clearly fast enough to warrant selection. But officials chose other runners, citing vague concerns about team chemistry and athletic preparation. Norman understood the real reason for his exclusion. The badge had marked him as unreliable, someone who might prioritize political statements over pure sport. Australian athletics officials preferred athletes who would compete and celebrate without complicating the experience with social commentary. His athletic career continued for a few more years, but opportunities diminished steadily. Sponsorship deals disappeared. Invitations to high-profile meets became rare. The Australian athletic establishment had effectively communicated its disapproval, and Norman found himself increasingly isolated from the sport that had defined his identity since adolescence. He transitioned to life after competition with difficulty. The silver medal had promised to open doors to coaching opportunities, speaking engagements, and business ventures. Instead, Norman discovered that his moment of solidarity had closed more opportunities than it created. Australia preferred its Olympic heroes uncomplicated and politically neutral. Decades. The 1968 Olympics became a distant memory for most Australians, remembered primarily for other events and other athletes. Norman's silver medal gathered dust while his gesture of solidarity was largely forgotten by his own countrymen. He worked various jobs, staying connected to athletics through local clubs and youth coaching, but never regaining the prominence his Olympic success had initially promised. Smith and Carlos, meanwhile, faced their own challenges in America, but eventually received recognition for their courage. Their raised fists became an iconic symbol of athlete activism, studied in history classes and celebrated in documentaries. They were invited to speak at universities and civil rights events. Their protest had achieved its intended effect, forcing uncomfortable conversations about race and power. Norman remained largely forgotten by comparison. Australian sports history moved on to other stories and other heroes. The badge that had cost him so much received little attention in the decades that followed. He had chosen solidarity over safety, and safety had proven more valuable in the long run. In 2005, as his health declined, Norman received an unexpected invitation. The San Jose State University, where Smith had attended college, planned to erect a statue commemorating the 1968 protest. Smith and Carlos had insisted that Norman be included in the memorial, arguing that his support had been essential to their gesture's impact. They wanted the statue to show all three men as they had stood on the podium that October evening. Norman traveled to California for the dedication ceremony. It was his first recognition in America for his role in the protest. Smith and Carlos embraced him as an old friend and fellow activist. They told the audience that Norman had risked more than either of them, since he had gained nothing personal from supporting their cause while sacrificing his own future in Australian sport. But the recognition came too late to repair the damage. Norman's health was failing, his athletic career long finished, his opportunities in Australian sport permanently closed. The statue would preserve his memory, but it could not restore the life that might have been. Norman died in 2006, still largely unknown in his homeland despite his Olympic silver medal and world-class athletic achievements. At his funeral, Smith and Carlos served as pallbearers, carrying the coffin of the Australian sprinter who had stood with them when it mattered most. The gesture moved those who witnessed it, but it could not undo the decades of neglect and punishment that had followed Norman's moment of courage. Australia finally acknowledged its mistake in 2012, when Parliament issued a formal apology recognizing that Norman had been wrongly treated by the sports establishment. The apology came 6 years after his death, too late to matter to Norman himself, but significant for the historical record. Politicians praised his courage and condemned the discrimination he had faced. A statue was erected in Melbourne, showing Norman alongside Smith and Carlos in the pose they had held on the podium in 1968. The memorial drew visitors and media attention, turning Norman into the kind of celebrated figure he might have become immediately after Mexico City if not for the badge. But the recognition felt hollow to those who had known Norman personally. He had paid the price for solidarity while living, receiving honor only after death. The badge that had cost him everything was finally acknowledged as a symbol of courage rather than betrayal. But the acknowledgement came too late to restore what had been taken from him. Smith and Carlos attended the Australian ceremonies when possible, insisting that Norman deserved equal recognition for his role in the protest. They pointed out that supporting others' fights for justice often required more courage than fighting for one's own rights. Norman had risked his future to support their cause, asking for nothing in return except the satisfaction of doing what he believed was right. The story became a lesson about the cost of standing with those who have been marginalized, about the price of solidarity in societies that prefer comfort to justice. Norman had won a small badge for 90 seconds and lost decades of opportunity as a result. In stadiums across the world, national anthems still played before major sporting events. Athletes stood with hands over hearts, representing their countries with the uncomplicated patriotism that sports administrators preferred. The ceremonies proceeded smoothly, without the disruptions that political statements inevitably created. Norman's memory served as a reminder that some gestures, however small, carry consequences far beyond their apparent significance. A badge barely visible in photographs had been enough to determine an entire career, to transform an Olympic hero into a cautionary tale about the dangers of political involvement. The silver medal remained proof of athletic excellence that no political controversy could diminish. But the real measure of Norman's achievement lay not in his running time but in his willingness to stand with Smith and Carlos when they needed allies most. He had chosen principle over pragmatism, solidarity over safety, courage over comfort. The choice had cost him everything the sporting world had to offer. but it had preserved something far more valuable than medals or records or recognition from his homeland. He had shown that doing right mattered more than doing well in life. The badge had been small, barely visible in photographs, but its significance had grown with each passing year. His sacrifice endured beyond his lifetime, teaching others the true price of standing up for justice when it was needed most of all.